Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we are going to be talking about the final story arc for the Sleepwalker series. And I gotta say, it's been a fun ride, and it's been a treat rereading it, for the purposes of doing a review. And originally, I was going to hold off on reviewing this particular set of comics as far as, this final storyline. I was going to do a movie or something, but something pretty funky happened happened with me today. And what happened was, okay, so my brother and I went and saw the movie Cocaine Bear over at Alamo Drafthouse, which, by the way, great movie. Both darkly comical and at moments legitimately scary. Because it is a bear, and a bear is bad enough on its own, but a bear on cocaine, even worse. So yes, definitely check that movie out if you get a chance in the theater. It's worth seeing on the big screen. So after that, I went back to my neck of the woods, and I just was kind of killing some time. So I went to Movie Trading Company, and so I'm just looking around. I'm looking, seeing some of the new stuff that they have, and way I see it, as far as toys and stuff like that goes. I mean, I hardly have ever grabbed toys or anything like that these days. I mean, it's like I'm always going to have a fondness for certain things, but at the same time I am a grown man, but yet I still love comic books. So I was kind of looking around, seeing what they had pertaining to that, just out of idle curiosity, right? And so I'm wearing this shirt. It's Sleepwalker, my Sleepwalker shirt. Yeah, so I was just kind of looking around, and look what I find in the toy section, namely amongst the Marvel toys that they have there at Movie Trading Company. Sleepwalker action figure, Marvel Legends. And I just, I saw that, and I'm just like, dude, it was just one of those moments, I mean, I would have had that reaction regardless of, whether or not I was wearing a Sleepwalker shirt, because, I mean, I love Sleepwalker. He's, a really cool comic book character, and, I really enjoyed his series, and so, but the fact that I was wearing this Sleepwalker shirt and saw this at the same time, it was just kind of like, okay, I've got to do it. And so I just I went ahead and got it, and yeah, it's just it kind of made me realize it's like, okay, if this together isn't a sign, I don't know what is. So I went ahead, when I got home, I went ahead and reread these last few issues of the Sleepwalker series. Namely issues 25 through 29 and 31 through 33, which altogether makes up the last arc in the series. And so I'd read it before, but for the purpose of doing a review on it, I went ahead and reread it, and I gotta say, it's better than I remembered it being, but at the same time, I still stand by my opinion that the first half of the series, namely the first 16 issues, was where Sleepwalker as a series was at its best, both in terms of writing and artwork. Bob Budiansky, consistently turned in good work as a writer, and Bret Blevins did the majority of the artwork on those first 16 issues. Of course, you had a guest art by Rick Leonardi on issue 4, which was good as well. And then, of course, a young Joe Quesada, doing guest art on issue 12. So, but for the most part, you had Bret Blevins doing, the artwork on that first part of the series. And then, it's like from 17 onward, there was kind of a decline. And it's not that the series became bad necessarily, but at the same time, I feel like whereas those first 16 issues did a pretty good job of, having sort of the type of whimsical tone that you would probably find in, say, the 70s or part of the 80s in terms of, what you'd expect from comic books, meeting sort of the, you had that, but you also had sort of this, gritty, urban reality that kind of came into play in comics of the 90s. And so that those first 16 issues actually did a pretty good job of walking the line between the two. But from, I would say, issues 17 onwards, it just kind of a lot of the characteristics that have kind of become cliche, or some, let me phrase that, the characteristics that some comic book readers would consider cliche, from say 90s comic books, they tended to come up out a lot more. Like the artwork looked a lot more quote unquote extreme, and edgy, and the whimsical feel that the series had kind of decreased, and it was more I guess you could say darker in tone and in visual appearance as well. And to be fair, Kelly Krantz, when he was starting off in the series, he was kind of like a Jim Lee XP, or at least I feel that's kind of what they were going for in terms of how his visual style looked. But he hadn't quite mastered, say, the art of capturing the human anatomy, like things being properly proportioned and what have you. And as a result, a lot of characters looked like, say, I guess you could say, some of the more extreme visual styles that came out of the 90s, like a lot of the stuff they'd see with, say, Image Comics or something like that. But to be fair, though, after having reread these the issues within the final arc of the series, I have to say that Kelly Krantz actually did gradually improve as an artist. I mean, I still say that Bret Blevins was more suited for the series, but Kelly Krantz, though, actually came a long way, considering he kind of started off within the series as something of a Jim Lee XP, but then gradually got to where it's like, hey, people are actually looking like people and things like that. And a lot of that might have had to do not only just with his ongoing practice in drawing when he was working on a series, but also with, say, the inkers that he worked with as well. So it's so it was pretty cool seeing the art go from point A to point B, and you actually see the the development and what have you. As far as the writing goes, it wasn't. If anything, I would say that while some of it kind of, also fell prey to some of the 90s edginess cliches that you would come to expect from some 90s comics, the writing in and of itself wasn't necessarily bad, because even when, say, the writing was at its worst, and there was just enough good in it to kind of balance it out to where it's like, okay, even if you don't like the ongoing storyline, there's enough development being given to some of the characters to where you're like, okay, you're at this point you're invested and you want to see what turns out, that kind of thing, or what comes out, I should say. But if anything, I would say that the main problem is that even though this particular arc was something like I believe it was 8 issues long, I would say that the main problem with it is that not necessarily the developments that happen, but mainly, say, it feels rushed, and part of that could be because the creative team may have had some knowledge that the series was going to be coming to an end at a certain point. So that's why a lot of the plot development feels hurried, even though there's a lot of stuff happening. But anyway, I'll get a little more into that. But the basic story, or the line, is that prior to issue 25, Rick and Sleepwalker had the bizarre experience of having switched bodies with each other. Like Rick's mind was in Sleepwalker's, and Sleepwalker's was in Rick's body, and so you had kind of a Freaky Friday twist, and that was actually pretty cool. And sometimes it was rather funny too. But one of the things that happened was that Rick met some. Bear in mind, Rick at this point was in the body of Sleepwalker, who was back in the mindscape, or he was within Rick's mind, I should say, and which kind of borders on the mindscape, since like every mind sort of connects to that dimension, as ultimate plane of existence. But he found members of Sleepwalker's race, and they were talking to him. Granted, they didn't know that he wasn't the one that they thought he was, because they're calling him by this alien sounding name, and they're talking to him as if they recognize him. And of course, him being Rick in an alien body, he doesn't know who they are, but he kind of plays along, right? And so he actually worked with them to fight through the hostile terrain of the mindscape to hunt down Cobweb. And so some of this team ends up getting killed by Cobweb and his monstrous denizens, but at the same time, though, Cobweb sort of, he's just been, toying with them this whole time, and he boots out, Rick and some of the other, people that survived, from his region of the mindscape. But he taunts Rick because he's saying, "Remember what you've learned about your new friends." And so, when Rick, comes back, when he and Sleepwalker, due to various plot developments, they end up switching back into their proper bodies. But one of the things that's happened is that Sleepwalker is no longer tied to Rick's mind, like as in he can go into the outside world without having to go back into Rick's mind. And so that's where the two of them had parted prior to issue 25. But one of the things that Rick was remembering from his time of running with these fellow members of Sleepwalker's race was that they were talking about an invasion, and he remembered some of what they were saying because but he couldn't remember all of it because he was partially incapacitated at the time. But what ends up happening is that Rick and Sleepwalker, at first, they're kind of happy to be rid of each other, but Sleepwalker, out of necessity, finds that he has to go to Rick again, because he finds out that the longer he's outside, the mindscape, or as the longer he's devoid of any sort of mental energy, which Rick's head was made full of. I mean, that's where he made his home for all these several issues. I mean, he's dying more or less, or at the very least he's being drained of strength. And so Rick basically agrees, but albeit reluctantly, to allow Sleepwalker back into his head, or to have the capability of going back into his head. And so Sleepwalker himself ends up, once he's back inside of Rick's head and is traversing that part of the mindscape, he finds out that he comes across the members of his race that Rick had come across, the ones that weren't killed. And basically they're calling to him by an alien sounding name, and much like Rick, they're talking to Sleepwalker like they all know each other. And Sleepwalker at first is like, what the hell's going on? And so I mean, you need, and somewhere along the way, both Rick and Sleepwalker find out kind of at the same time, albeit on different planes of existence. Sleepwalker in the part of the mindscape that he was in, and then Rick finding out by way of a nightmare brought on by Cobweb, because Cobweb's still running around inside of his domain, and basically playing all sorts of twisted mind games with Rick. So he's quote unquote helping Rick to remember what the members of Sleepwalker's race had said to him. And he and Sleepwalker both learn at the same time that the members of his race intend to invade Earth, and by way of using Rick as a doorway into our reality, into our physical reality, I should say. And so, basically, that's what ends up happening. I mean, Rick, as he's asleep, he is helpless to, prevent them from, literally coming out of his head. So it's like, it's bad enough having one alien come out of your head, but imagine like a whole, army of them. And so, at first, Sleepwalker, I mean, he doesn't know what's going on. Like, he doesn't know, he doesn't recognize any of these, fellow denizens of the mindscape, that are his, kind, even though they look like him. And, they're referring to themselves as the mind spawn. And of course, the Sleepwalker not knowing who they are and not recognizing the name, I mean, he's, kind of clueless as to what to do and flabbergasted in a lot of ways. But as this army of mind spawn comes out of Rick's head into our reality, they basically, declare all-out war, on the city of New York. And they start rounding people up, in this, really sudden sneak attack. Like they start, destroying, infrastructure. They start, basically they have these things called mind rakes, which they do look like rakes, except a lot more H.R. Geiger-ish in terms of design. But they use them to, basically rip the mental energy out of a living being, and all that mental energy, goes into the mind rake, which in turn goes into them. And so the people who are subjected to this are basically turned into, zombies. I mean, not like undead zombies, but like basically they're very lifeless, and their eyes are blank and what have you. And so basically, they start doing this to all the people of New York that they can find, and eventually they get to where they start rounding the citizens up, and forming this weird architectural dome that's sort of twisted and warped from materials that are laying around. But because it's like they're all using their warp beams, like everything is just alien looking. And they're intending on using these people as kind of like a food supply, at least in terms of being able to feed off of their mental energy. And what they're wanting to do is, I mean, they've established a beachhead in New York, but they're wanting to have a steady supply of food, as it were, so that way, when it comes time to, spread out some or push forward, they have, enough of a boost in order to be able to do so, because, they intend to keep the rift open, so that way, this more of them will keep coming out. And so, while this is going on, a couple of things happen. One, Sleepwalker ends up, quote unquote, killing Rick, to prove his loyalty, to his fellow comrades, and by way of, using the mind rake on Rick, and, basically just, subjecting him to the same fate as all the other people who have been hit with the mind rake. And so his loyalty to his race being established, he also puts down a potential mutiny from a fellow member, and basically overpowers him in combat, so that way he can control the army. And so, while this is going on, Rick's ex-girlfriend, Alyssa, she sees all this, and, she's shocked, because, she's one of the few people, who have actively defended Sleepwalker, time and again, trying to say, hey, just because this guy, looks weird, that doesn't mean he's a monster. And so, and the goodwill that Sleepwalker's, generated by helping people, I mean, it hasn't gone unrecognized, but, with him taking part in an alien invasion full of soldiers that look like him, all that goodwill goes out the window. And so, you have that going on. And then the Avengers are called in. And it turns out that the person who called the Avengers in was actually, a member of the police force that Sleepwalker had interacted with several issues prior, and she had actually had the bizarre circumstance of having worked with the Office of Insufficient Evidence, or is it inefficient evidence or insufficient evidence? I think is what it was called. And so, but she was like the one who said, hey, Sleepwalker is actually, doing more good than harm, whereas you guys are doing more harm than good, by rounding up people and scanning them with your devices, to test for Sleepwalker's presence, So she's, just as shocked as, say, Alyssa and all these other people are that, Sleepwalker seems to be partaking of this invasion. And she's the one who, and she actually, persuades them, the National Guard, who have come into New York at this point, to try and fight back against the invasion. They actually do a pretty good job. I mean, all things considered. I mean, they're still outmatched because this is like a whole army of sleepwalkers, more or less. So as powerful as one sleepwalker is, a whole army of them is just devastating. Although they do manage to, since their weaponry is heavier than or the police force's weaponry, like they're able to get some hits in, so to speak. But nonetheless, they are being whittled down and just taken out. But then the detective, from the story arc, several issues ago, she's the one who persuades the National Guard to not call in an airstrike because that's what they were originally going to do. And what, because they were thinking, okay, this, alien army is, is continuing to grow, and, our weapons are cutting it. But, when she makes the call to the Avengers, the team at the time, which consisted of, Crystal, and then who was Quicksilver, his wife. So you had Crystal, Cersei, Hercules, Black Widow, and the Black Knight. And, basically, this, squad of the Avengers comes in and is able to save the day. And so this army of sleepwalkers, they retreat, and they're thinking that the threat's over, but Sleepwalker himself, who actually, tried to, help some of the civilians, throughout this invasion by way of, taunting Hercules and tricking him into, helping him to destroy the containment that these, people were in. He's trying to explain to them that, hey, they're retreating, but they're gonna, come back. And so the Avengers initially, they go from not trusting him to, trusting him once, some of the people that, were being held prisoner, admitted that Sleepwalker actually, got them out of there. But, before they can fully trust him, Alyssa, with the help of another soldier, brings, Rick's seemingly dead body, to the forefront, basically saying, well, okay, if you haven't harmed any humans if you haven't really harmed any humans, then how do you explain, Rick being dead? Because one of the things that happened was after Sleepwalker had quote unquote killed Rick to prove his loyalty, he basically boasted about it, where everyone could hear him. And, Sleepwalker's trying to explain that, hey, I was trying to buy some time here. But before he can explain, the full extent of his, rushed plans, the Avengers turn on him again, because, it's like, on one hand, he tricked them into, helping him, get the people out of the prison they were in. But at the same time, he still made it look like he was working with the, mind spawn, but at the same time, he was in a position where, if he had, tried to, say, resist the whole army, they would have overwhelmed him. And so he kind of had to, fight within, plain sight, so to speak. But since he's badly injured during the fight and drained of his strength, he has to retreat, and so basically he just warps the scenery around them, to where the Avengers are delayed, so that way he can make an escape route for himself, and he's able to go underground, but they can't find him, and so all this has happened. Rick is buried, and they have a funeral for him. And so Alyssa, she doesn't know, what's happened, to Sleepwalker, but she's, determined to avenge Rick's death by bringing Sleepwalker to justice somehow. And so one of the things that's kind of, happened as a consequence of this invasion is that while the army retreated, one of their own was left behind, and it turns out it was the Mind Spawn that soldier that had challenged Sleepwalker, or I should say that Sleepwalker challenged, and took leadership from, and he's been left in a weakened state, like he's kind of drained of energy and more skeletal almost. And so the authorities have managed to take him prisoner, and he's being held in this facility that doubles as a hospital and a prison. But he's got these tempered titanium shackles, on his hands and feet, and he's kind of being, held up like this, and he has this helmet on him that covers his face, or at least this part of his face, and it prevents him from using his warp beams, because of whatever the material is made of on the inside. If this Mind Spawn attempts to use its warp beams, they'll be turned on in himself. And so and they also have his mind rake, or I should say the mind rake that it was his, but Sleepwalker ended up taking from him, and that the Avengers in turn took from Sleepwalker. And so it's being held in the same facility, and also in the same place is a serial killer, a gentleman by the name of, excuse me a moment, Jeremy Romeo Roscoe. And the Romeo comes into play because he's actually a serial killer who's killed 14 women that the authorities know of, and cut out their hearts, and because he believes that he needs the hearts to feed on, to give him strength and life. But he says that he's actually killed 18. So who's telling the truth? And so they're testing him. They're holding him in the facility because while he's serving his prison sentence, he volunteered for a medical experiment. Like they're trying to figure out exactly what it is that makes him, serial killers like him tick. And while all this is going on, a couple of politicians are being given a tour of the place, and so that's how the readers in turn introduced to this member of the Mind Spawn that's being restrained in the facility, and that's how we come to meet this new serial killer. And this politician makes the mistake of leaving a pin within easy reach of Jeremy, and so even though he's restrained, like he's able to get a hold of the pin, and he's able to eventually use it to get out of the restraints. And he's about to kill the nurse who is supposed to be feeding him, but the security there, they managed to spot him in time, but they can't prevent him from escaping. And he actually is able to temporarily blind their cameras, with the food that the nurse was giving him, and he makes it into the ventilation system and goes into the room next door, which quote unquote just happens to be where this Mind Spawn soldier is being held. And so Mind Spawn, he's picking up on Roscoe's energy, on his mental energy, and he's basically begging for Roscoe to feed him, as in to feed him his mental energy, and because he's dying more, or at least he feels like he's dying. But instead, Roscoe, he's looking at the guy. He's like, I wonder if he has a heart, and then just stabs him, with the knife he managed to, take off of the food tray before being stopped by security from killing the nurse. And as he does so, there's like this weird electrical reaction. I guess maybe because the mind spawn creature is from another dimension, and so as he stabs him, it's like this energy just sort of starts flying all over the place, and the security comes in, finally, but they're unable to prevent the outcome of Roscoe and this mind spawn soldier from fusing into one really bizarre, twisted, depraved individual, Psyko, who totally looks like an albino gremlin on steroids, and it has a bit of the mind spawn soldier and a bit of Roscoe, in a sense that he still has a fondness for human hearts, but he also has a fondness now for hunting Sleepwalker down, since Sleepwalker is the one who screwed the mind spawn soldier over, at least according to him. But he also has the power to drive anyone around him insane, and so he escapes the facility and causes havoc all across New York City, which they're just starting to get over the invasion of the mind spawn soldiers. But then now this Psycho guy is literally going around driving people insane, and Sleepwalker during all this was trying to recover, because it's been a couple of days, and he still is not at full power. And a vagrant named Pike was the one who found him and basically kind of tried to nurse him back to health. And so Sleepwalker, he's watching TV with Pike, and he actually saved Pike, which is why Pike's helping him in the first place. Some hoodlums were trying to beat him up or possibly kill him just for entertainment, for Pike, and Sleepwalker, in his weakened state, was still able to scare them off. But once he collapsed, Pike took him back to his humble abode, and this is after he retreated from the Avengers, and so this is where he's been this whole time. But as he's watching TV with Pike, he sees Psycho, and the havoc that he's causing, and he recognizes some of the features on Psycho's body as belonging to the mind spawn, and so he tries to go out there to stop him, but he's too weak, and so he persuades Roscoe to let him have some of the energy that's in his mind. And so he promises Roscoe, not Roscoe, he promises Pike, that it's not going to harm him. The worst that's going to happen is he falls asleep. And sure enough, that's what happens. Pike falls asleep while Sleepwalker gets a sufficient amount of energy to be able to go into combat. But he doesn't take all the energy he would need for this, because that would cause Pike some, a lot of harm. And so he takes just the amount he needs to go into combat. And unfortunately, though, it's not quite enough, because while he's able to put up a fight against Psycho, Psycho is able to use his powers on Sleepwalker. And so all this is going on, and the populace of New York is being driven insane. And anyone who tries to come in and help, it runs the risk of falling to a populace that's been brought to mass hysterics, or being driven to insanity just like everyone else. And so it's not a good situation. But then a familiar face shows up, Spectra, from way back in issues 13 and 14. She's actually made kind of a new life for herself. Like, she's not with her abusive boyfriend anymore, and she's actually working. She has a new job and everything. And in a rather odd way, Sleepwalker's the one who kind of gave her that second chance, even though at this point in time, he had been basically reduced to being a drug addict, because he was addicted to this new frequency of light. And so during that, because of all that, though, Spectra, ironically, due to being transformed into the being that she is now, she was given a second chance by her interaction with him. And so when she sees Sleepwalker involved in this fight with Psyko, and having seen that Sleepwalker had taken part in this alien invasion, she kind of blames herself for all this, because she had the opportunity to kill Sleepwalker a while back, but actually took pity on him and let him stew in his own juices, as it were. And but because Sleepwalker's back and seemingly causing even more havoc, she's on the scene to try and bring Sleepwalker to justice. But at the same time, though, she also realizes that this Psyko, is just as bad. And so, she doesn't really know what's been going on with Sleepwalker, as far as, why he took part in the invasion, or why he seemed to have led it. And she doesn't know that, she doesn't know what the story is with Psyko. All she knows is that, these two guys have done a lot of damage to the city. And as all this is going on, Sleepwalker, unfortunately, ends up falling prey to Psycho's insanity. And when this happens, he's, granted, not as determined to hold back when he's fighting, but at the same time, the skills and expertise that he has, kind of go out the wayside. Like, he's just lashing around like a maniac. But Spectra is able to knock him out and contain him, and she intends to execute him, but not before showing him the damage that he's caused. And so she brings him to this makeshift field hospital that's being used to try and treat the people who have been afflicted by the mind spawn, with the mind that had been hit with the mind rakes. And so she's wanting Sleepwalker to see what his actions have caused, because as far as she knows, he was the leader of this alien invasion. And Sleepwalker's trying to explain, no, I didn't do this. But she doesn't give him a chance to really explain himself. And so she uses this frequency of light to try and stir any sort of spark of awareness in the patients in this facility. Because remember, anyone who's been hit with a mind rake is turned into a zombie, more or less. And the medical team there is trying to stop Spectra, but she persuades them to let her use her light abilities to sort of allow them to testify in this makeshift trial. And so they reluctantly agree, because they're wanting to know if there's a way that they can bring these people back to normalcy, because as far as they know, as the extent of damage that's been done, some of it's been permanent, but some of these people might actually be able to, with a couple of years of therapy, they might have some restoration of their abilities. But they're trying to see if this interference by Spectra can help, and so that's why they reluctantly allow her to do so. But Spectra, while she's expecting them to basically all condemn Sleepwalker, the majority of the people that she's able to get through to, they sort of sluggishly explain that Sleepwalker is not the one who did this to them. Like, there were other people that looked like him, but it wasn't him. And a couple of them even say that he was the one who saved a lot of the people. And so, this really throws Spectra off. But unfortunately, though, she's still determined to try and stop Sleepwalker, from playing any more games. Because she's seeing this kind of flip flopping, at least as far as she could tell. And so Sleepwalker, he and Spectra, they are unfortunately still enemies at this point. But then also Psycho is still a problem, and eventually, Spectra comes to realize that Sleepwalker is telling the truth. I mean, she was, forcefully confronted with the fact that, he's not the one that did all this to the people. But she also, realizes that Sleepwalker, whenever he's, fought against her or anyone else for that matter, he's, made every effort he could to hold back. And even when he's being driven insane by Psycho, there is a part of him that's still holding back. And so, she tries to help him, by, using her light manipulating abilities, but unfortunately, the insanity is just buried too deep. And so Sleepwalker has just enough awareness to tell Spectra that he needs to confront Psycho and, and end it, in person. And he has to basically, fight Psycho, to some extent on his own home turf within the mind. And so, this combat is set up. And so while this chaos is going on in New York, Spectra and Sleepwalker are able to team up to take Psycho down. And it's a tough fight, but they do succeed. And so once that happens, the insanity that had been forced onto Sleepwalker dissipates, and Spectra, goes her own way, but thanks Sleepwalker for giving her a chance, and also for proving her wrong, and so at this point, Rick Sheridan, while he's dead and buried, he's kind of not dead. It turns out that he's in some weird mental landscape, that kind of starts off as some dream version of his room. Then it's like a big white space, and then it's this weird twisted organic mess, and he's being taken by these monsters into this weird domain, and it turns out it's Cobweb's territory. And so Cobweb is basically, he's like, welcome back, old friend. And and he has Rick all immersed in these weird organic webs, and he's taunting Rick with this being the hereafter. There's no heaven or hell. This is what comes after for everyone, more or less. And all that's and all you have to do is just give in, and you'll become a part of the landscape. And so, while Rick is being hit with this traumatic experience, because he's literally being merged into this slimy organic wall in Cobweb's domain, and while this is going on, Sleepwalker, he's he's able to he's put in a position to where he's able to get the mind rake back, and he hightails it to Alyssa, and and he forcefully persuades her by way of intimidation to show him where Rick's buried, because he's telling her that we can still save him. I can still save him. There's just enough time. And so, as she takes him to the grave site, he takes the grave out of the ground and opens the casket, so that way they can see Rick's body. And sure enough, there's no pulse or anything, but he uses the mind rake to try and get Rick back. But instead, what ends up happening is it kind of sets off this sort of mental alarm that makes Cobweb aware that someone's tampering with Rick's body, and so at this point, several of the Mind Spawn, Sleepwalker's own people, as it were, take over some nearby citizens, and they come as kind of this ad hoc army to the cemetery to stop Sleepwalker from bringing Rick back. And Alyssa, though, because she's able to get a hold of the mind rake, she's able to sort of defend Rick, and at the same time, while this is going on, Sleepwalker ends up going back into the mindscape, to try and get to the source of all this, because unfortunately, whoever's keeping Rick in a coma, or not in a coma, but in this state of death and life, it's more than the mind rake is able to handle. And so while Alyssa's kind of holding the people off at the mind rake, Sleepwalker goes into what's left of Rick's mind and into the mindscape itself, or at least a part of the mindscape. And that's when he comes face to face with Cobweb, and he's also attacked by a lot of pissed off mind spawn who are calling him traitor and what have you. And so Sleepwalker fights back, and he's being overwhelmed. But at this whole time, he's professing his ignorance of who they are, because he's like, you keep saying, I'm your leader. I don't know you. You forced me to be a part of your invasion in order to stop you. And so that's when Cobweb comes clean, so to speak. He basically removes this disguise that they've all had, and you find out that these mind spawn, yes, they are mind spawn, but they're not Sleepwalker's people. They're monstrous denizens of the mindscape who are loyal to Cobweb. And so you have these gruesome monstrosities that this whole time have been disguised as members of Sleepwalker's race. And so this whole bit of story, going back to the arc that was that issues 19 through 24 was telling, like when Rick and Sleepwalker's body came across these fellow Sleepwalkers, this whole time they were actually mind spawn in disguise by way of Cobweb's abilities. And this was like a very, very powerful attempt at gaslighting both Sleepwalker and Rick, because he put Sleepwalker, his most persistent foe, into the position of having to take part in the invasion, or otherwise, he would be killed because of the overwhelming force, as well as not being able to save Rick Sheridan. But on the other hand, by Sleepwalker, taking part in this invasion to where, the public can see, they lose trust in Sleepwalker. And so that way, the very people he's trying to protect end up being, afraid of him again. And so, and as for Rick Sheridan, Cobweb, considered it, kind of, his version of the chef's kiss, as it were, to have, Rick, be the living portal, for his army of mind spawn to come out and basically just, excuse me, overwhelm humanity, because all of humanity, it's like they're connected to the mindscape. And if there's something that can give a good portion of humanity enough trauma, then that will give his forces, all the strength they need to spread outward and overwhelm everyone and everything. And so, going from, the mindscape into our realm. And so, this whole, with this explanation out of the way, both Rick and Sleepwalker have a better understanding of what's going on. But at the same time, Rick's, convinced that it's pointless to fight because, he's becoming more and more a part of, Cobweb's domain. But Sleepwalker forces him to look into the real world by way of a portal, that they're able to see through. And, and he's saying that there's Alyssa fighting for you. And, as Rick is looking, he notices something. He's like, wait a minute, Cobweb said that I'd been dead for weeks. So if I've been dead for weeks, how come I still look so good? And he's not trying to be arrogant. It's like his body literally looks good, as opposed to, say, decayed in any way. And so, he's like, if Cobweb's lying about me, being dead for weeks, then, he must be lying about a bunch of other stuff too. And so that gives him the strength to sort of, fight back and pull himself out of the wall that he was becoming a part of. And Sleepwalker, in turn, is given inspiration to fight back as well, because Rick realizes that Sleepwalker was not his enemy, but just had to pretend like he was his enemy. And so the two of them, they fight through the forces of Mind Spawn and make it to Cobweb. And Sleepwalker, in a really awesome moment, tells Cobweb that he realizes now why he's been able to exert as much power as he has into the real world, by way of, his mental manipulations and, making Rick be the portal and everything. And because Cobweb, as powerful as he is, has never had this kind of power before, until Sleepwalker, most recently had tried pursuing him. And that's, say, way back, to the first couple of issues. And it's because that his device that we last saw in like the first 2 or 3 issues, the Imaginator, which is like this badge that all members of Sleepwalker's species have, that allows them to, go from one plane of existence to another, or I should say one mental, plane of existence to another. Rick, in one of the dreams that he was having where Sleepwalker manifested, Rick in his panic had actually, pulled it off of him, and it was lost into the, landscape of, dreams and nightmares. And without it, unfortunately, Sleepwalker has found it, next to impossible to go back into his realm, or to, his, home plane of existence. But he realizes now, that it's because, Cobweb, somehow, got a hold of it, and he's been using its power, to, send out this army of Mind Spawn, through, Rick Sheridan himself. And so Sleepwalker, he literally tears into Cobweb and pulls the Imaginator out of his, body. And so it's like, this whole time the Imaginator had been, inside of Cobweb. And so, once Sleepwalker is able to rip it out of him, he and Rick are able to, banish Cobweb by using its powers, like its raw power. And granted, it's mostly Sleepwalker doing it, but, Rick's, providing what support he can, since, he and Sleepwalker are kind of linked at this point. And so Cobweb, ends up, being banished into, some other, plane of existence that's far away from humanity, period. And at the same time, though, the army of Mind Spawn are, forced, to retreat, because they realize that, the amount of power that Sleepwalker has, he can wipe them out, and he actually does wipe them out. And so, it's like the ones that retreat are able, they do what they can and beat it, but a lot of them are, wiped out by the raw power of the Imaginator as manipulated by Sleepwalker. And so, after this, he collapses, and Rick's, saying, "Hey, I think this fight took a lot more out of you than you're saying." And so Sleepwalker keeps insisting that he'll be fine, but he needs to get back into our realm in order to be able to save Rick. And so he goes back into our realm, and from Cobweb's realm, and so once he's back in the real world, Alyssa, she's still standing guard over Rick, and all the people who had been possessed by Mind Spawn, they're sort of coming to, but Sleepwalker, assures Alyssa that they're not a threat. And so, once they disperse, he gets the mind rake back from Alyssa, and he channels its energy into bringing Rick back. And sure enough, the force and the energy that he's using, Rick is able to come to, but unfortunately, at the seeming death of Sleepwalker, because he used all of the energy and channeled it, through the mind rake in order to bring Rick back. And so, Rick, he was trying to explain to Alyssa that, he can't really explain it, but he wasn't really dead, just somewhere in between life and death. But, before they can, fully comprehend what's been going on, Sleepwalker, who has collapsed on the ground, they try and help him, but he instead vanishes before, everyone's eyes. And so, Alyssa, she's, devastated because, she realizes that, Sleepwalker was trying to help after all, and he's just, died to bring Rick back. But Rick's trying to assure her that it's possible that Sleepwalker is not dead, because, in order to work together, they had to reestablish their link. And Rick's saying that it's possible that Sleepwalker is back in my head now, but it might be a while before he's able to come back out again, simply because, it might be some time before he fully recovers. But in the meantime, though, Rick's back, and, he hopes to, start life anew. And so that was the final, arc in the series. And I have to say that, I mentioned it before, but it's not as bad as I remembered it being, because the first time I read it, it was just like, man, this was, a letdown. But reading it again, though, in a lot of ways it could have been better, but there are some things in there that I thought were well done. Like the bait and switch bit that they did by way of Cobweb, and his disguising of the Mind Spawn to make them look like members of Sleepwalker's race. Excuse me. That was a very inspired tactic, I think. I like the fact that this was like one massive gaslighting attempt to basically turn humanity against Sleepwalker, while at the same time using the fear of Sleepwalker to power his armies. And so I thought that was actually pretty cool. And as far as an attempt to get revenge on Sleepwalker, and hurt him before killing him. And I also liked how the Avengers were brought in, because one of the things that you try and figure out some of the time is, where are the Avengers in all this? And so it was nice, to see them actually, taking part in an alien, in stopping an alien invasion in their home turf. But I also liked the fact that, I had my issues with the villain of Psycho, but I did appreciate the fact that they made him dangerous enough to where it was almost impossible for, anyone to stop him, simply because his very presence, made people insane. And it took Sleepwalker actually going, into, the, fighting Psycho on his home turf to ultimately take him down, albeit with some help from Spectra. And I enjoyed seeing Spectra again. It was nice to see that, she had grown as a character, and while she wasn't, say, a superhero, she had definitely, per se, she definitely had turned her life around for the better, and was trying to help out, the people around her by, putting it into Sleepwalker's, reign of terror, at least as far as she saw it. Granted, she didn't really know, that Sleepwalker, wasn't really a bad guy, up until, it was kind of too late, or almost too late, I should say. So I liked seeing them bring Spectra back. But I also, kind of liked, how they made Cobweb, even more scary this time, because in the prior arc, I mean, you make no mistake that he's a genuine threat and a horrifying one as well. But they seem to kind of borrow from I guess you could say the funny phase of Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street. Where Freddy Krueger was killing people, but making puns about it the whole time. So he went from being scary to, okay, ha ha ha, that kind of thing. But this particular arc, though, I think made Cobweb, just full on scary, especially in the scene where, or I should say, in the scenes where he's taunting Rick, with the possibility of there being no heaven or hell. It's just this void, that kind of thing. I mean, that's some stuff that kind of stays with you. So pretty good writing on Bob Budiansky's part. And also, I have to say that Kelly Krantz, while his artwork tends to be hit and miss in the series, you could definitely see that in a lot of ways he was getting better as an artist. And so the scenes whenever, he was, drawing Cobweb in his domain, those scenes actually looked pretty good in terms of, like, the weird organic, nightmarish quality to, the visuals and what have you. And in some instances, he was pretty good at drawing people as well. I should say his ability to draw people seemed to get better. But at the same time, though, it seemed like when you had the moments where a bunch of stuff was going on, like as far as action goes, that's where, his artwork seems to be a little more rushed. And unfortunately, the action was happening quite a bit, so you'd have quite a bit of, rushed instances of art. But at the same time, though, it seemed like, for select moments, they pulled things together to where it's like, okay, you can see where Kelly Krantz and, whoever was working with him, to ink the stuff, kind of pulled together, and you could definitely see Kelly Krantz, growing as an artist. But I think where I'd say, while this arc was better than I remembered it being, it's not as good as it could have been, because there were several moments where I was wondering, well, okay, I understand that to some extent Sleepwalker has to, keep up the facade of, being the leader of this army, just to keep them from, doing, worse damage than they already are. I understand why he would think that, but at the same time, I mean, you would think that he could have found some way in all this to, send a message out or something to let, certain people know that, hey, here's what's really going on, send help, that kind of thing. I mean, I did appreciate that they brought back the police, I believe she was a detective, from that storyline, way back in, issues. I think it was like 10 or 11. I appreciate that they brought her back, since she was familiar with the Sleepwalker, and she's the one who ultimately called in the Avengers, so I thought that was a nice touch. But at the same time, I mean, I would think that, Sleepwalker being familiar with some of the superheroes, that live in New York City, or at least, having interacted with some of them, I like to think that he could have sent a message, to some of them, so that way reinforcements could have come in a lot sooner, and the body count would have been significantly lower, because a lot of people have been permanently damaged, unfortunately, at least as far as I could tell within these issues, because, another thing I was trying to figure out is, okay, if Spectra could use her abilities to, have these zombies, testify against Sleepwalker, as she was planning on doing. I mean, I was thinking that maybe she could have worked with, the medical team there to, use her light abilities to, bring the, their consciousness back, but I don't know if that was just, something that the creative team didn't think about, or if it was one of those instances where, I mean, as powerful as she is, she has her limits, that kind of thing. So whereas she could bring, some form of, awareness, to the people that, she was trying to get to testify against Sleepwalker, like she wasn't able to bring on like a full-on emergence of conscience or something like that. And it would have been nice, I think, if they had, tried to acknowledge that, or have her attempt to do that, and then just say, hey, I'm sorry, but, but I don't know how to do that, or I can't do that. But it would have been, it would have been nice if, there had been an acknowledgement of maybe, say, that particular situation, and maybe, have Spectra, have a throwaway line of, once, we've dealt with Psycho, I'll do what I can to help these people, or something like that. So that way, even if you don't see it on page, there's the slight reassurance, that even though after the series has ended, Spectra's, doing her part to try and, help these people out, that kind of thing. I mean, that would have been nice, but, unfortunately they didn't really, cover that. On the other hand, it's like there was a lot of miscommunication, I feel like, especially when it comes to the character of Sleepwalker himself, because, as I said, I mean, if he had just talked to someone, or if he had gotten a message out to, the various super people that are in New York City, a lot of this mess could have been avoided, or at least, reduced in terms of the damage it caused. But the other thing was the character of Psyko. Like, he was definitely a threat for sure, but the way he came about I thought was pretty stupid, because, I mean, you have this facility that's a prison and a hospital kind of put together, but they have really shitty security, and they literally had a homicidal maniac in the room next to an alien soldier. Granted, they're both restrained, but at the same time, you're like, okay, you've seen what these members of the Mind Spawn can do. Who in their right mind would, leave them detained alone, as in, there's no security keeping an eye on them other than cameras. Like, there's no one, say outside the room to, make sure that, hey, this guy's not trying anything. And same with, the serial killer, because, I mean, yeah, there's a camera there, but there's no soldiers or anything or guards outside of the rooms specifically. And so, when Roscoe, makes his escape. Also, the other thing, I mean, the politician they had, walking through the place was way too chummy with Roscoe. And basically, he knew that Roscoe was a serial killer, and he, cut the hearts out of at least 14 women, but still he's like, oh yeah, I'll sign an autograph for you, literally. And he's the one who leaves the pen, within reach of Roscoe, and Roscoe is able to use that pin to escape. So yeah, thanks a lot, politician. And so it's like a lot of the people look like idiots, because of this. And it's just one of those things where, I mean, it really, it's like you have this high-tech facility and you have these experts running it. I should say experts, but hardly anything in the way of security until it's too late. Like, security guards don't come running until after, Roscoe's gotten out and, merged with the Mind Spawn to become Psyko. So that part, I was just kind of like, that was really stupid. But to be fair, though, Psyko himself turns out to be a really dangerous threat. Now, some of his dialogue I felt was like, over the top cheesy, like sort of funny Freddy Krueger, kind of like, the similar complaint I had with Cobweb in the last arc. But at the same time, though, Psyko was genuinely a threat. Like, he might joke about something, but the damage he was causing was real. So I did appreciate that, at least. And plus, his visual design was actually pretty cool too. Like I said, he looks like a gremlin on albino gremlin on steroids. So. But the other thing that I think, I guess you could say I had an issue with was, while I do appreciate the depth of cruel intellect that Cobweb had in terms of being able to, put this plan together, one of the things that a lot of readers were trying to, figure out was, where's the Imaginator? Because, you would think that that would be Sleepwalker's first priority, in the series, is to try and get that back, but, it's, shown that, Rick, ripped it off of him, and it, is lost somewhere in the mindscape. But other than Sleepwalker talking about it, on occasion, which isn't very often, oddly enough, there's no other mention of it until the final issue. And it's like I think it's called a MacGuffin, like a plot device that solves everything, which, it's eventually, that's literally what it becomes, but it's not until the final issue that Sleepwalker's, actually says, this is why, Cobweb's so powerful, and so, this is what we need to stop him, and it's inside of Cobweb the whole time. And just, I think that if they had, maybe had a few storylines where Sleepwalker, was trying to find it or something, but maybe, they see what they could have done, I think, was, maybe they could have had a storyline where Sleepwalker does try to do that, but in the process, though, like maybe, he comes across a different plane of, a different plane of the mindscape, or a different part of the mindscape that he's never been to before, or something like that. That would have been cool to see, because the mindscape itself was fascinating the way it was illustrated, and I was like, anytime you see a picture of it, you could tell the artists were having a field day. So just imagine, you have all these, parts of the mindscape that Sleepwalker's familiar with, but then, he's going into a part that he's never been to before, trying to find the Imaginator. That could have been, a good storyline, a couple of issues worth, but it's literally not brought up until the final issue. And so while I did appreciate the touch of, the Imaginator literally being inside a Cobweb, and he's using it to power his, or further enhance his abilities, and I did like the, kind of gruesome moment where Sleepwalker just, rips it out of him. That was actually pretty badass. But at the same time, it was just kind of like, you're waiting till now to, find the darn thing. Now, granted, it's only because he just realized it, but I just think that the creative team could have, gotten some more mileage out of the series if they'd had at least a couple of stories where Sleepwalker tried to find a darn thing. So, and while I am glad that, Rick and Alyssa kind of seem to get back together, if the final page of the last issue was anything to go by, it would have been nice if there'd been, I mean, not necessarily a soap opera, storyline, but just like, or it would have been nice if there had been an issue or two, within all this, where, Rick and Alyssa kind of got back together to where they were more than just friends and they were boyfriend and girlfriend again, and maybe, Rick told her what was going on, especially with the whole Freaky Friday twist. If he had told her that, when she was interacting with Rick at that time, it was actually Sleepwalker. I mean, that would have been a fascinating conversation, especially, because, Alyssa was one of the few people who actively defended Sleepwalker. And so, as cool as it was to see Alyssa, play a big part in this story, I wish that there had been a moment or so where they could have, had her and Rick get back together, so, but yeah, that was the final arc of the series, and overall, I would say it was like it could have been better, but it wasn't bad though. And I'll go ahead and give it 3 out of 5 stars. And like there are moments I would say that were good, but at the same time, I think the rushed quality and the sort of I guess you could say uneven artwork, tended to kind of bring it down because the writing was never bad, but you could definitely tell that the plot development was more rushed than say the earlier issues were. And the artwork by Kelly Krantz, I mean, was 50-50. Like, the instances where, it looked like your typical edgy 90s art, that's where it sucked. But, at the moments where, he put more focus on, trying to, draw realistic people, or, as well as, put more detail on, depictions of the mindscape whenever, say Rick was being tortured by Cobweb or something like that, that's when you could definitely see where Kelly Krantz was improving as an artist. So I guess I'm kind of spoiled though. I mean, I like my good artwork to be consistent, that kind of thing, so, but when it was good, it was good, but when it sucked. But he did get better though, so that was nice to see. But yeah, so all in all, not a bad way to end a series, but at the same time, because of the rushed quality, it unfortunately, ends on a note where it's like, I mean, yeah, it's not a bad way to end the series, but it could have been so much better, and they could have done a lot more. And the other thing is, the way they have, Sleepwalker's fate be kind of open-ended, because of the rushed, plot development in the final, this kind of carries over into the final issue because, I mean, Rick, offers the sort of vague assurance that, Sleepwalker's still alive, but he can't say for sure, but at the same time, I mean, they could have had maybe a panel or two, showing Sleepwalker, sure enough, being alive, or maybe like coming to in some darkened part of Rick's mind, but saying something like, I live, but I must recover now, or something like that. But I'll be there when when Rick needs me or something. I mean, that could have been, just a throwaway panel. But it would have helped a lot in terms of proving that Sleepwalker was in fact still alive, just in need of recovery, as opposed to, say, Rick just assuming that's what was going on. Because, with respect to Rick Sheridan as a character, because he was one of the main characters, I really think that, a lot of readers tended to, prefer Sleepwalker over Rick Sheridan. So it just would have been nice if there had been like a definite, moment showing that Sleepwalker was alive to still reassure us readers who love the guy, But yeah, so yeah, that was the last arc. 3 out of 5 stars. So I was gonna, as per usual, I'll go ahead and show you all the cover art here, but I want to show you all this. So this is issue 25. You can see by the lighting, it's like a foil cover. So that's pretty nifty, huh? Issue 25. And There are a couple of pieces of pinup art. By, like this piece, you know, kind of cute and wholesome, by Rick Leonardi, who did the pencils back in issue 4, which had Bookworm. And then another piece by Rick Leonardi with Rick, Alyssa, and Rambo. Oh, and I forgot to mention, there is a backup story in this issue, wherein you know, Rick Sheridan, he's with his college buddies, and you know, they're doing some aerial shots for a film project, but he ends up falling out of the plane that that they're in, and you know, prior to that, you know, he had whacked his head in the process of falling out, and so he's knocked out. And so, you know, Sleepwalker comes out of, you know, Rick's mind, and he realizes that, you know, Rick's falling to his death. And so, you know, in these, you know, moments, you know, he's trying to, you know, get Rick to the ground safely without waking Rick up, because, you know, at this point in the story, you know, Sleepwalker can only come out of Rick's mind, you know, when Rick's asleep. And so, you know, whenever he tries to catch Rick or, you know, keep him from falling, you know, the air and the physical, you know, sensation of being touched, you know, is enough to, you know, bring Rick back to wakefulness again. And so Sleepwalker, kind of in a Hail Mary shot, kind of warps part of the landscape, you know, on the ground to sort of, you know, become this makeshift net that catches Rick. And so once his buddies, you know, get back on the ground, you know, in their plane, you know, they're, you know, stunned that Rick's still alive. And except that one of them managed to film Sleepwalker. And so he's thinking that, hey, man, you know, we'll be famous and everything. Rick accidentally, you know, bumps into the guy to where the guy's camera falls. So that way, you know, any proof of, you know, Sleepwalker, you know, is sort of, you know, gotten rid of. And so that was the backup story. So didn't have any bearing on the overall plot of, you know, the rest of the stories, but it was just like a one-off, you know, story. But I did like seeing Bret Blevins come in to do some guest art, so that was nice. But real quick, yeah, so that was just one of the pages there. But you know, it was welcome to see. It was a welcome addition, you know, to the issue. But so yeah, it's issue 25. Issue 26. Issue 27. There you go. These are the Mind Spawn, albeit in disguise as members of Sleepwalker's race. You got the Avengers right here. You got Hercules, Black Widow, let's see, Black Knight, Crystal, Vision. Forgot to mention that he was part of the team here. And Cersei, right there. So yeah. And you got issue 28 with the debut of Psyko. Contrary to the cover, Psychotic is not his name, it's Psyko. So yeah, Gremlin on steroids. Issue 29. There's Spectra right there. Issue 31. I love this cover, by the way. Sleepwalker and Spectra. It would have been nice if, you know, this... While this kind of does happen in this issue, I mean, the circumstances for it are very different, but it would have been nice if there had been like an issue or two wherein, you know, Sleepwalker and Spectra actually did kind of become an item. It would be interesting at the very least, you know, since Sleepwalker is more or less an alien, you know, so But yeah, nice cover. 32. Psyko, Sleepwalker. Last but not least, 33, the final issue. I love this artwork, though. And yeah, there's Cobweb right there, and he looks just as scary on the inside. And there's Rick right there trying to cheer with Sleepwalker on. So yeah, that was Sleepwalker, y'all. That was the end of his series, but not necessarily the end of his story, because, you know, fast forward several years after the series, he would pop up from time to time, you know, in a supporting capacity here and there. But he kind of came back into the spotlight, you know, in the latest Infinity storyline, in which Darkhawk was also a part of as well. So, and of course, you know, he had to have had some reputation in order for, you know, Marvel to go ahead and, you know, put out this action figure of his, which was really cool. So that's definitely good on y'all, Marvel, for doing that. But so yeah, end of the series, but not necessarily the end of his story. But it's been a fun ride. It really has. And you know, reading the series from beginning to end and rereading it, you know, to do these reviews, you know, it's just even say when, you know, points in the series weren't as good as others, I mean, it was still overall a fun experience. And so if you're wanting to see you know, some good 90s, you know, if you're wanting to see a good 90s comic or, you know, read something, I mean, definitely check out Sleepwalker if you can. And it'd be not, and I don't know if Marvel has any plans to do this, but if anyone from Marvel's listening, definitely put some trade paperbacks out for Sleepwalker, because I mean, we got the Infinity storyline that he was a part of. That's in trade paperback, but come on, for the original series, you know, first 16 issues at least, give us that much, because, you know, if you, especially those first 16 issues, that was, I think, the series at its best, and I think that's where, like, a lot of people would really enjoy the series. But yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to check this out. I apologize for the length of it, but hey, you know, this, you know, the end of a series, you know, that, you know, I've really enjoyed, so hey, pulled out all the stops, right? But thanks for checking this out. Thank you for taking the time to, you know, listen to my take on the series, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. And y'all have a good night. Take care. Sweet dreams. Bye.